Throughout this series, we've been wrestling with the distinction between God as a concept and God as a person. Now, of course, we've not been learning that God is either conceptual or personal. What we've been learning is that our conceptual idea of God must be subordinated to God as a person. God, as he has revealed himself through the prophetic tradition of Israel and the apostolic witness of Jesus, is the person who defines the concept of God. Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became flesh in the person of Jesus, is God. There is no other God. Whatever it means to be God is defined by his person. We must resist the ease with which our conception of God might be defined as the Jewish tradition had understood God, or as the Roman tradition had understood gods and goddesses, or as you or I understand God, or gods, or higher powers, or whatever else we might say. In John chapter 18, I believe the apostles have insisted that God is to be understood conceptually, in terms of who Jesus was, in terms of what Jesus did, and in terms of what Jesus said personally. God has revealed himself to us most comprehensively in the person of Jesus. Consequently, I believe we as Christians should be less concerned with whether Jesus meets a set of abstracted criteria for divinity, and more concerned that our understanding of God is consistent with the person of Jesus. So far in John chapter 18, verses 28 through 40, we've encountered 2 of 3 areas in which the concept of God has been in conflict with the person of God. The first conflict was between the predictable and the unpredictable. The second conflict was between the controllable and the uncontrollable. The third conflict we find in this passage brings opinion into confrontation with reality. God as a concept dwells safely in the realm of opinion, but God as a person confronts us in the realm of reality. If you have access to a Bible, I invite you to turn with me to John chapter 18. I'll pick up reading in the second half of verse 37. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." Opinions are quite safe in most respects. Up to this point in the narrative, Pilate had been given one set of opinions about Jesus from the Jewish leadership, and he presumed that Jesus himself had an opinion about himself. Pilate then had the responsibility of determining his own opinion about the situation before him. There is no truth in these types of situations. There are only opinions, and it is the responsibility of the judge to decide upon a course of action. Jesus, however, reframed the encounter in terms that it would appear Pilate was either unwilling or possibly unable to embrace. Jesus moved from the venue of opinions to that of reality, to that of truth. Even more, Jesus suggested that truth was to be determined in response to him. As Pilate suggested to Jesus, truth, like beauty, is often in the eye of the beholder. 20th century playwright Lillian Hellman has been credited with saying, "Nobody outside of a baby carriage or a judge's chamber believes in an unprejudiced point of view." That pretty much sums up one of the foundational assumptions of what is often called today postmodernity, and it is an appreciation that now permeates our culture. It would be unfair to say that most of us today deny that the truth, capital T, exists. What most of us do seem to deny is that we have any objective way of knowing truth for certain. Let's face it, none of us, as hard as we might try, can be completely objective. Everything we experience, everything we learn, everything we witness, everything we hear, everything we see, everything we read, all of these things get filtered through a complicated web of genes and history, assumptions, experiences, culture, tradition, beliefs, and on and on. Perhaps surprisingly, however, long before postmodernity, Jesus himself revealed the true relativity of the truth claims of humans. The Gospels highlight a variety of groups of people in the first century who all experienced Jesus in the flesh, but all interpreted him in different ways. Within Jewish culture, Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, the disciples of Jesus, Roman tax collectors, and even those Jewish people who had chosen to live habitually in rebellion against the stipulations of the Covenant of Sinai. The New Testament calls them generically sinners. They all heard, interpreted, and responded to Jesus quite differently. Some of these groups agreed on certain things and disagreed on others. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians all agreed Jesus needed to die, for instance, but they seem to have come to that conclusion for quite different reasons. The Pharisees and the tax collectors agreed that Jesus was being excessively gracious in his interpretation of the law of Moses, but the Pharisees thought that disqualified Jesus from being the Messiah, whereas the tax collectors and sinners flocked to him. And even among non-Jews, this same Jesus was understood in various ways. For God-fearing Gentiles, like the Roman centurion mentioned in the Gospels, Jesus was a spiritual general who could control the unseen forces of the world. But for Pilate, Jesus seems to have been a powerless and harmless fool. All these people encountered Jesus personally, but none of them seem to have agreed as to his identity or as to his significance. Even among Jesus' own disciples, there was some disagreement. Peter proclaimed Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah, and James and John seem to have presumed the same when they asked him to be seated at Jesus' right and left hands in his kingdom. But none were prepared for his crucifixion. Judas felt free to betray Jesus to the Jewish authorities, and even after Jesus rose from the dead, Thomas thought that the man who claimed to be the resurrected Jesus might have been lying. All experienced the same Jesus, but none interpreted him in precisely the same way. And even after Jesus rose from the dead, ascended to heaven, and poured out his Spirit on the earliest believers, disagreements persisted. The earliest Jewish community, for instance, didn't think that Samaritans or Gentiles should be accepted into the church without first submitting to some of the Torah. However, Peter, Stephen, and the later Apostle Paul disagreed. Even more, most of the writings of the New Testament are attempts to address various distortions of Jesus' message. The point to all of this is simply to observe that no purely human perspective on anything is completely objective. No matter how objective we believe we are, we have all distorted the truths we claim to know to one degree or another. Postmodernism might be the most recent philosophy to highlight this reality, but it's not a new insight. We today have asked again a question that Pilate himself asked Jesus some 2,000 years ago. What is truth? The question is a valid one, and one that humans should always keep before us. I think that I would argue, the more certain we are that we have possession of the truth capital T, the more damaging to the message of the gospel of Jesus we can be. In fact, in many ways, the Christian Church's overconfidence in its own claims about God, Jesus, and reality may be one of the greater failures of the Church truly to appreciate the Holy Scriptures in all of our history. Lutheran minister and theologian Richard John Neuhaus once wrote, "Few things have contributed so powerfully to the unbelief of the modern and postmodern world as the pretension of Christians to know more than we do. If Christians exhibited more intellectual patience, modesty, curiosity, and sense of adventure, there would be few atheists in the world, both of the rationalist and postmodern realities." Truth, little t, is an opinion which we believe to be a close or helpful approximation of whatever reality we're talking about. Truth, capital T, is the reality itself. And for Christians, truth, capital T, is not an opinion or a doctrine or a conception or a philosophy or a creed or you fill in the blank. For Christians, truth, capital T, is a person. Ultimately, that person, that truth, is God. But the truth, capital T, which has encountered us in the flesh, is God in the person of Jesus. Jesus doesn't teach truth. Jesus is truth. The truth is a person. the person of Jesus. All of our truths, little t's, however distant they may seem from the question of Jesus, are only truths if they find their ultimate subject in truth capital T incarnate, in Jesus. So the question, what is truth, can be an earnest one. If it assumes and appreciates the Scripture's insistence that whatever truth is, it was walking around in the flesh in the person of Jesus, then it can be a question that keeps us open to the reality of the one God, Yahweh. However, if the question, what is truth, is asked apart from Jesus, then for Christians, the inquiry is invalid. Pilate seems to have asked the question in this latter way. By asking what is truth, Pilate sidestepped the claim of Jesus to be the truth by insisting that the present moment resided in the realm of opinion, not of truth. And by framing the situation that way, Pilate took Jesus' testimony off the table. If truth is simply to be understood as what people believe to be true, then it was Pilate's opinion that ultimately mattered in that moment. He used the question, what is truth, to dismiss all opinions but his own. However, Jesus' confrontation with Pilate suggests that one's encounter with Jesus does not fall within the scope of opinion. A person's encounter with Jesus lies in the realm of truth, capital T. Opinions may have been all that mattered technically for Pilate, but Jesus set himself up, not as an option to be considered, not as a set of claims to be evaluated and decided upon, but as reality itself, as the truth. Jesus had said as much earlier in John's Gospel in chapter 14, verses 6 and 7, which says, Jesus answered, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on you do know him, and have seen him. Pilate used his appreciation of human limitation to ignore Jesus' words. But Pilate had no way of knowing with whom he was conversing. No human does on our own. We who believe not because we have some corner on truth or because we know everything there is to know about the Bible or about God or about the universe or anything else. We believe because we too have been encountered by this Jesus, by this reality, by this truth. At some point, I hope, all humans will experience that encounter in some way. But only those who embrace the reality who confronts us will inherit what Yahweh intends for humanity. Sadly, however, many today behave similarly to Pilate when confronted with the reality of Jesus. Why did Pilate and why do so many today wish to conceptualize God, to evaluate Jesus as an idea to be considered? If the New Testament is a guide, it is most likely not because people fail to appreciate the significance of Jesus generally. I suspect our refusal to approach him on his terms is because the reality he represents turns the world as we wish it to be, upside down. One's decision about Jesus may seem like an opinion, but it is in fact a decision about which reality in which to live. That decision influences the entire shape of our existence. If Jesus was not who he and his apostles claimed him to be, then reality is altered fundamentally. We must envision a world without the God of Scripture, and we must live lives without reference to him. If Jesus is who he and his apostles pronounced him to be, then our opinion of him, of his behavior, of his decisions, of his treatment of us, is in the end irrelevant. He exists. Nothing I think about him can change that, and I have to live with that reality regardless of how I feel about it. Mark Twain once wrote, "Fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't." Because God is personal and not merely conceptual, we must release our conviction that decisions with respect to Jesus constitute opinions, and instead embrace Jesus' claim that decisions about him are decisions about reality itself. When one chooses to trust a person, it always involves a degree of risk. And the risk is greater still when the people in question purport to have met reality himself in the flesh. But in the end, this is precisely what faith is: a decision to trust the perspective of another. And if the perspective of the apostles is to be trusted, the decision we make ultimately with relation to Jesus is a decision to embrace not a concept or an idea which can be predicted, domesticated, or controlled, but a real living person who is who he is and has graced us with the invitation to choose regarding him. The people of Israel looked to the events of the Exodus principally as the revelation of who God essentially is. And again, for Christian faith, alongside of the Exodus, our estimation of God's character and integrity must be made in light of Jesus. We may never know for certain if we know the truth, capital T, about anything, and that is an awareness that Christians would do well to keep ever before us. But to be Christian, we must embrace the reality that whatever truth, capital T, might be, it was incarnate in the person of Jesus. Most Jewish leaders seem to have approached Jesus with stones. Pilate turned his back on his claims, convinced he was simply a man like any other. Others seem to have selected out the most appealing teachings and behaviors of Jesus and incorporated those things into their own perspective on life and truth and reality. But a smaller number have believed him to be the truth, capital T, he claimed to be. And whatever we think of the history of Christianity, those few have changed the course of human history irrevocably. I hope, with them, you too will choose to follow Jesus.